Hello, I'm Sage, and today I have the explicit pleasure of talking to you about a very specific area of the Roman Empire, and not in terms of location, but about a sometimes overlooked staple, the Roman diet. This includes many factors and elements, and we're going to go into all of those in more detail. We're going to cover taxation in the form of food, and how the diet changed over the centuries. We're going to look at the extant isotopic evidence found and what that's able to tell us about the quality of the diet in various Roman provinces and what that means for Rome on a greater scale. We'll examine the Mediterranean triad, and we're going to contest the argument that Romans were largely vegetarians or vegans based on that evidence uncovered. Overall, we're going to examine a lot of different factors that will help round out our understanding of how the people of classical Rome ate. And also, this video is going to show some recipes courtesy of the 1st century Common Era chef Apicius. First things first though, I don't look nearly Roman enough, so... Now, obviously not historically accurate, but it's long and off-white and flowy, and we're just going to pretend this is some kind of flax linen weave, and it'll do. 2 quick disclaimers before we get into the nitty-gritty of all the content. 1, all of my sources are listed in the description box below, or you can view them in real time if you turn on closed captioning. 2nd, this is a personal interpretation of the evidence uncovered. Some is obviously not up for question, but keeping in mind this is one interpretation of the evidence. If you have a different one, that's totally cool, and I'd be happy to have a discussion about it. Now, there's a lot of ways that you can discuss food and diet in classical Rome, but for the purposes of this video, we're going to examine the diet in Rome through the lens of a class struggle. That is to say, food and dining were, for many ancient Romans, a way of showing ostentatious displays of wealth and status. And Rome was quite literally founded on the notion of eating. In Virgil's The Aeneid in Book 7, they speak of knowing where to found Rome. Well, okay, the quote goes like this. I'm just going to read it. "When food has failed to eat your very tables, then you may look for home. Be mindful of it, weary as you are, and turn your hand to your first building there with moat and mound. Here we have felt that hunger, here at last." Looking at the writings of Cicero, Pliny the Elder, and Seneca the Younger, who were all more or less members of the elite, Mira Green argues that each author's interest in the alimentary process is actually a manifestation of the social and political changes of the late Republic and early Principate. Each of these writers had comprehension surrounding nature and knew how to frame their discussions around the workings of the human body and what went into them as a result. For example, Cicero argues that the body's alimentary process demonstrated nature's divine foresight, which associates the body's economy with the structure of the household and the hierarchy found within those walls. While under Nero, Seneca the Younger's writings are largely that of critique, which is pretty telling of the time he lived in because Nero largely undermined the positions of the elite in particularly intimate ways. Now, the article is fantastic and absolutely worth the read, but the general takeaway is that each author highlights the discontent with the political and social changes of his respective time, but somehow manages to relate that to the alimentary process and eating and availability of food. Now, elite Romans were often more concerned with the prestige of a meal than they were necessarily with the quality or taste of it. And how do we know this? Well, thanks to Apicius, we actually have some 1st century Common Era recipes. Things like flamingo and peacock meats and ostrich and a whole wackadoodle of other stuff that are luckily not featured in today's video. But like I said, they were much more concerned with prestige as opposed to flavor. Don't imagine flamingo would have tasted all that good. And again, meals were ostentatious displays of wealth for the rich. And an example we can see of this is in the Satyricon, which is a 1st century work of fiction by Gaius Patronius. Starting around chapter 26, he describes the feast of Trimalchio and this extravagant meal he's prepared. And to quote it directly from chapter 31, it reads, "A donkey in Corinthian bronze stood on the sideboard with panniers holding olives, white in one side, black in the other. 2 dishes hid the donkey. Trimalchio's name and their weight in silver was engraved on their edges. There were also dormice rolled in honey and poppy seed and supported on little bridges soldered to the plate. Then there were hot sausages laid on a silver grill, and under the grill damsons and seeds of pomegranate." Now, that may not seem as extravagant as peacock or flamingo meats being served, but it gives a pretty good image of how the wealthy performed mealtimes, especially for guests. In contrast, the poorer classes, or really the majority of Romans, ate a very different kind of meal. Breakfast was called ienticulum, and largely would have consisted of bread and salt or cereal, like some kind of grain. Lunch was usually an animal byproduct, like maybe some fish sauce, egg, and a vegetable of some kind. But the wealthy Romans, when we come to dinner, ate dinner in 3 parts. First, gustatio, second, fecula, and third, mensae secundae. This brings us to the idea of the Mediterranean triad, which if you've taken any kind of ancient history course, you'll remember that consisted of 3 elements. Grain, which would have been wheat, millet, barley, olive oil, and of course, wine. And keep this in mind as we're going to come back to it. Now, the availability of foodstuffs within the empire was a thing of constant fluctuation. Weather, disruptions in the food supply line, bad harvests, any number of things could affect the availability of a certain product. Pliny the Elder makes a point of addressing this concerning the availability of foodstuffs. He highlights both the, quote, choicest productions and contrasts that in kind with acknowledging that certain things just were not available or, quote, denied to the community at large. And this idea that some wanted for more than others is especially prominent in Rome for many things, but particularly when it comes to food. There's a lot of scholarship that talks about this concept of diet and accessibility, but let's quote Pliny directly. He says, "Of people too, living upon nothing but the choicest productions of the confectioner, and upon pastes fashioned in fantastic shapes, of one kind of bread being prepared for the rich, and another for the multitude, of the yearly produce of the fields being classified in a descending scale, till it reaches the humble means of the very lowest classes. In this department even, humble as it is, we are still destined to find certain productions that are denied to the community at large, and the very cabbages pampered to such an enormous extent that the poor man's table is not large enough to hold them." Heavy stuff, right? But the takeaway is that the contemporaries in this time actually recognized the disparity with regard to the accessibility of food within the empire. Taking a look at the more impoverished citizens of Rome, including slaves, Columella also addresses this, and he says, "Accordingly, a careful master inquires not only of them, but also of those who are not in bonds, as being more worthy of belief, whether they are receiving what is due to them under his instruction. He also tests the quality of their food and drink by tasting it himself." Basically, it was essential, of course, that the master had good food and was in good health, but also equally important was that his slaves were held to the same standard. Now, this notion is not only indicative of Roman slavery practice, especially where food provision is concerned, but it can also be tied in with the Edict of Subsidized Grain that was implemented by Gaius Gracchus. The wealthy were able to secure foods from across the Mediterranean, importing spices and other extravagant displays of their wealth. Not that they necessarily knew how to cook with them, but more so because it was a show of their status. The lower classes, however, within Rome relied on grain for the majority of their daily caloric intake, and this brings me to taxes. Now, back in classical times, taxes weren't always paid in physical currency like we do today. In Rome, this would have taken the form of payment in coin. However, while currency payments grew in popularity as the empire aged, the majority of taxes were collected in the form of substance, aka farmable goods. Grain was a large part of this substance, and it wasn't always cheap. Taxation in the Greco-Roman world was a dizzying and complex system as a whole, and Sven Gunther argues that it needs to be examined through the lens of seeking out good and bad emperors, since it was them who were both the beginning and end of taxes in the Principate. On that topic, we can examine Gaius Gracchus and his implementation of the grain law. During his first tribunate from the years of 123 to 2 BCE, one of the first measures Gracchus implemented was a law that provided grain to citizens at a fixed price. Now, the majority of the writings on this law lean towards an anti-Gracchus perspective, but it still holds importance. The biggest achievement of this law was that it introduced consistency and a regulatory supply of grain to the capital. This allowed storage facilities to shore up against potentially bad harvests or disruptions in the supply chain. It was a political move to be sure, and one that fit with his overall motif of undermining the senatorial government, but most importantly, it granted access to grain to the majority of Roman citizens at a reasonable price. This grain dole remained a point of political contention until the end of the Republic. It was at first open to all male citizens of a sufficient age in Rome, but Cicero stated that 33,000 medimnoi would have been a sufficient distribution of grain for the lower classes, which implies about 40,000 beneficiaries. Cato the Younger expanded this to include the poor and landless in 62 BCE, which meant that there was some kind of restriction on it previously. In 58 BCE, Clodius abolished the cost altogether and transformed it into a free gift. In the 40s, the number of recipients rose dramatically, but under Julius Caesar, this number went down to about 150,000 recipients. In the 3rd century, this grain dole was actually replaced with the distribution of bread, which meant that the whole system needed to be revised. Remember the Mediterranean triad we talked about earlier? Let's go back to it. This triad is the foundation for the assumption that Romans were largely vegetarians. The belief was that there was little meat available to the majority of Romans, but thanks to isotopic evidence uncovered, we know this isn't necessarily the case. Biochemical studies of bone can show us the dietary practices on an individual level and give us an approximate proportion for the amount of animal protein in their diets. Evidence taken from the Roman Britain sites of Cirencester, Alcester, and Stanton Harcourt showed that the people who lived there were not in fact vegans or vegetarians. This particular study has some more important implications as well for the broader understanding of the Roman diet itself, but most critically, it questions that age-old theory that most Romans lived off grain-based diet throughout the empire and for the lower class in particular. Going even further into Roman Britain, the book Food in Roman Britain by Joan Alcock looks at the evidence from skeletons once again to glean a larger understanding of the overall diseases and quality of diet. She makes a note that while dating is difficult and regionalism poses its challenges, Romans had a very distinct dietary identity. That was a lot of human. I don't even like human. Okay. Mussels a la Indian food. The Romans brought with them new crops to Britain, and Britain under Roman rule experienced a greater variety of foodstuffs. Economically, they were able to transport this new supply of crops thanks to the series of Roman roads, because Romans loved their straight roads. Bear with me here, a ton of the isotopic evidence I researched for this video was based out of Roman Britain, so we're not done with it just yet. Looking at diet and trade on those straight Roman roads, analysis of pottery sherds can offer us some insight into diet as well as the usage for that pottery. A study of 7 pottery sherds from Silchester done by L.J. Marshall, S.R. Cook, M.J. Almond, and M.G. Fulford found that all but one of the sherds had evidence of animal residue. Again, this ties in with our earlier discussion of Romans not being vegetarians and vegans. Now, the Roman diet and the quality of such changed over the centuries. Examining the classical, Hellenistic, and Imperial Roman periods thanks to isotopic evidence at 2 cemeteries close to Athens, we have some more information. To contrast our earlier argument that meat was available, we can look at this evidence. During the Imperial Roman period, for example, the evidence shows that there was a significant reduction to the amount of protein consumed, which also indicates a deterioration in the standard of living. Now, one of the crucial things to consider when examining Roman food and diet is the military's role. The military obviously continued to increase in importance throughout the empire, and feeding them was both a duty and a challenge. Livy makes a note of this with regards to how soldiers might have fared in the heat of battle. He says, "Any attack on a fortified position involved much toil and danger. There was but little to be got out of the country, and the soldiers were reduced to scanty food, as they could secure very little plunder." We now know, though, that soldiers likely subsisted on fish sauce. An article by Wim Brokert tells that thanks to the archaeological record, we're able to determine the importance that fish sauce consumption actually had, especially within the Mediterranean triad. There are amphorae that show the presence of fish sauce, and their import is well attested up until the beginning of the 2nd century. However, in that same century, the supply chain connecting the northern provinces and the rest of the Mediterranean came under pressure. Some interesting facts here are that the Iberian imports weren't able to compete with the cheaper local alternatives in the middle of the same century. Plus, a revolt in the last decade of the 2nd century severely harmed the Iberian agricultural production and export economy. Soldiers could also be punished with barley rations. As Polybius notes in Histories, those on whom the lot falls are bastinadoed mercilessly in the manner above described. The rest receive rations of barley instead of wheat and are ordered to encamp outside the camp on an unprotected spot. This is referencing deserters, but it's interesting to know that barley was an appropriate consequence for such. It hasn't changed much over the years, honestly. Barley still isn't that great. But just how easy was it to properly secure food, especially if you were among the lower classes? Well, thanks to the evolution of the grain dole like we talked about earlier, getting your basic needs met became less stressful. But it wasn't that nutritionally sound on its own, right? Well, Madeline Brown in her pilot study examined the actual biological and nutritional properties of the ancient Roman diet in order to better understand the origins and how it changed over the course of 2 millennia. The study showed that while, yes, Romans ate primarily grains, legumes such as lentils, broad beans, and chickpeas supplemented the non-grain-based calories for the people of the time. So just looking at this recipe here, this is the one currently on the stove. When they said clean hard-skinned early fruits, I just did a quick Google and they said, hard-skinned fruits were like apples, grapes, oranges, stuff like that. So I did that. I didn't crush the pepper here because they even say like they don't think it's that, but anyways, the connection suggest term probably stands for some kind of aromatic spice. So I'm gonna crush some cloves and allspice in the mortar and pestle in a second and stew slowly, and then I'm gonna add some flour. Coming back again to the Mediterranean triad, the overall nutritional properties of the ancient Roman diet depended on the 3 core elements of grain, olives, and wine, but neither the nutritional properties nor the frequency of consumption for any particular foodstuff was written about by classical authors. So we've covered a lot in this video, but here are the takeaways. The combination of isotopic evidence and classical authors' account of their own times allows us, here in the year 2020, to glean a well-rounded understanding of how the people in Rome ate. The wealthy were able to provide for themselves through their own means, but the poorer classes had to rely on subsidized or free grain. Their diets were much more scanty in comparison. The army was supported with fish sauce or relegated to barley rations if they were punished. The trade and export economy and taxation in the Republic and Principate phases of Rome evolved as new provinces were better able to care for themselves. And as you've watched me semi-cook a few recipes from Apicius' cookbook, it also shows what kind of food was available for them to secure. Don't buy raisin wine unless you fancy spending over $50 a bottle or you have a project to recreate their recipes. And definitely make the fruit compote for your guests at the holidays. Overall, the people of Rome ate and lived a lifestyle both different and similar to our own. Food scarcity is an issue in our world today, and no one should need to rely on the powers that be to provide them with free bread just to make it to the end of the day without hunger pains. The political and status displays surrounding food in ancient Rome are indicative of a socially and politically motivated structure that demonstrates both the benevolent and malevolent aspects of the emperors, and how the elite dictated the quality of life for the majority of those under their rule.